Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'd like to start our discussion. And my name is Mykhailo Samus, and I'm director of New Geopolitics Research Network. It's a new international organization we're trying to make some analysis on geopolitics. And our project with name of Geopolitics 30 years after, starting with first event, Ukraine and Bosnia and Herzegovina own path and geopolitical turbulence. This is our first event in the line of events on this topic. So we are trying to analyze and trying to understand what happened after the end of the Cold War on our region, on our space, geopolitical space, and we'll try to make a forecast what actually could happen again, or maybe could happen in new dimensions and new reality and new understanding of the situation. Organizers of our event is the Center for Nationalist Studies from Bosnia and New Geopolitics Research Network. It's our organization. I'd like to propose you today to discuss such questions. What kind of changes happened in Ukraine and Bosnia and regions around for last 30 years? What are the main trends, problems, and challenges for Ukraine and Bosnia and Herzegovina today? What is the forecast for next years for our countries? And we'll try to find answers for these questions and maybe forecast future. Let me introduce our great team of speakers and discussants. Dr. Zlatko Hadžidedić, he is associate professor and director for the Center for Nationalist Studies, Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He specialized on international relations, nationalist studies, and political theory. And I like that he has a special approach to nationalism as one of the aspects of the international relations and geopolitics. So I very like to listen to him, and I'm sure that his keynote speech today will be excellent. Dr. Adnan Huskić has profound experience in research from both domestic and international issues. Dr. Huskić is the country representative of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom in Bosnia and lecturer at the Sarajevo School of Science and Technology. Dr. Katarina Šimkević, she's an expert in Analytical Center of Balkan Researchers, Ukraine, professor in the Zaporizhzhia Institute of Economics and International Technologies. She has great background in studies Balkans, so we could expect fusion analysis of the comparison of Ukraine and Bosnia now from her. Mr. Adnan Idrisbegović, Bosnia. He was an officer of the Bosnian army during the war 1992-1993, Bosnian government liaison team member in UN Profor at the Sarajevo airport 1993-1994. He works in Embassy of Germany, assistant to the ambassador, and now he's a private entrepreneur and independent researcher. And I think that he will give us his own understanding of the situation and the comparison of Ukrainian and Bosnia situation. And Dr. Anatoly Demescu is a historian, Balkanist, journalist, and international observer in national news agency Ukrinform, it's Ukrainian agency, and expert and one of the headliners of the Analytical Center of Balkan Researchers, Ukraine. So I think we have a great team. The scenario for our event is that Dr. Hadžidedić and me will have our keynote speeches, and after this we'll have discussion with our discussants. And of course, it's possible to make questions. It's possible to make remarks and maybe to react on our discussion. So I ask our participants, our auditorium, to take part actively in our discussion. Now, without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Hadžidedić, director of the Center for Nationalism Studies, for his keynote speech. Dr. Hadžidedić, please, up to 15 minutes, if it's possible, for yours.
Thank you, Mykhailo. So let me start with the reason to put Ukraine and Bosnia together in this event. I discussed it with Mykhailo, and we came to a conclusion that there are many similarities, many parallels. First of all, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia happened about the same time, with very similar developments that followed, with the creation of nation states out of former republics of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. And eventually what we both got as the main problem we had to deal with was the concept of nationality, the concept of national identity, which came to be a matter of conflict between the neighboring republics. I would say that what happened after the breakup of Yugoslavia, the breakup of the Soviet Union, was actually the introduction of capitalism. That's the first thing. And I think, and that is a part of my theory that Mykhailo was referring to, which says that actually capitalism needs nationalism in order to create a sustainable social framework, that capitalism simply needs unification of society in order to bridge the gap between the richest and the rest of the society, to actually serve as a glue or as a cover for that wide gap between the richest and the rest of the society. But despite the fact that there are several types of nation states, several types of national identities, mostly theorists divide it into civic and ethnic ones. What happened in both Bosnia and Ukraine is the introduction of ethno-religious, I would say, rather than ethnic national identity as a pattern that was implemented. Instead of, say, creation of a common civic Bosnian identity, we got the introduction of the national identities which were claiming actually to cede parts of Bosnia, to make them to cede them to Croatia and Serbia. And similarly to that, what happened was the situation in Donbass, in which some citizens of Ukraine did not really want to be citizens of Ukraine, but rather opted for secession and to be ceded to Russia. So that's something which is very interesting, because that's certainly a pattern which destroys any country we're applied to. I would like to say, I don't know what Ukrainian experience is. I don't want to speculate on that. I have my opinion, but still I will leave it to the Ukrainians to decide. But our experience in Bosnia is that actually this pattern was introduced by the so-called international community. Or to be more precise, by the then European community. Now it's the European Union, but at the time in 1992, it was the European community. The European community organized a conference, the so-called Lisbon Conference, which is rarely mentioned these days, really. You can never hear any word about the Lisbon Conference. People who are talking about Bosnia, they are mainly referring to the Dayton Agreement as something which has destroyed the structure of Bosnia and so on, but actually the Dayton Agreement only verified the principles which were adopted at the Lisbon Conference in '92. And that was the February 92. So it was 2 months before the war, or even 3 months, depends how you take the beginning of the war, because it had some phases of the beginning. So there was no war around to negotiate on the peace agreement, to introduce any kind of partition of the country in order to create peace. No, the European community, which was represented by Lord Carrington and José Coutilheiro, a Portuguese diplomat. Lord Carrington was presiding over the conference on the breakup of the dissolution, actually, of the former Yugoslavia. So he was in charge on what I would call dissolution of Bosnia as well. What happened at the Lisbon conference was actually devolution of the state sovereignty of Bosnia-Herzegovina to its not even ethnic groups, but its ethno-nationalist parties. There were representatives of 3 ethno-nationalist parties at the Lisbon conference. Alija Izetbegović, also a member of the presidency at the time. Radovan Karadžić, now convicted as a war criminal, and Mate Boban, who was president of HDZ, the Croatian Democratic Party. Karadžić was president of SDS, Serbian Democratic Party, and Izetbegović was president of SDA. It was a Muslim Democratic Party action, so-called. So practically the European community imposed the pattern of ethnic partition of Bosnia and devolution of sovereignty to these 3 guys who were at the negotiating table. Ever since, the pattern of ethnic sovereignty was the dominant one in Bosnia. Nothing else has ever been negotiated afterwards. Since the Lisbon conference, what we have is simply the story, the narrative of ethnic sovereignty of 3 ethno-nationalist parties, which have the right to their own territories. And the war itself was actually the implementation of the maps which were adopted at the Lisbon conference. What is most important to say is that the maps were adopted, the maps of ethnic partition, several months before the war, and that the war itself and what the armies did on the ground in the battlefield was actually the implementation of these maps. So in reality, the so-called Yugoslav army, which was representing Serbia and Montenegro at the time and was helping the Serb Democratic Party in Bosnia-Herzegovina to acquire the territory which was granted to it at the Lisbon conference. They occupied the parts of the territory according to these maps. The same happened with the Croatian army of the state of Croatia and the units which were represented the Croatian Democratic Party from Bosnia-Herzegovina. So they both cooperated with external powers, with Serbia and Croatia, in occupying the territories which were granted to them. And what remained was still called a Bosnian territory, but we experienced something very interesting, that all the media in the West, especially those centered in London, were launching the news about Muslim army, Muslim territory, Muslim this, Muslim that. So all of us who considered ourselves Bosnians were very surprised with that, because they simply redefined and redesigned our identity into Muslim. At some point, we realized that they wanted to create a Muslim statelet also on the basis of these maps from Lisbon. And eventually, all the events during the war were about the territories, how to implement the maps from Lisbon to satisfy all the parties. They did agree on that in Lisbon, but you know, the appetites were rising as some of the armies were more powerful than others and so on. So eventually all the peace conferences, including the Dayton one, were about satisfying the appetites of these three groups, which were granted territories by the international community, by the European community at the Lisbon Conference. To the present day, we have the same problem. The sovereignty of the state of Bosnia has not been restored, ever. We still have partitioned sovereignty. You know, political theory says that sovereignty cannot possibly be divided and cannot possibly be transferred. That's the basic idea about sovereignty, at least popular sovereignty, modern understanding of sovereignty. But what happened in Bosnia was precisely the opposite. Bosnian sovereignty was partitioned, divided, and then partitioned, and then transferred to three ethnic groups or three ethno-nationalist parties to control their separate territories, two of which were actually planning to cede parts of the territory and make them parts of Serbia and Croatia. So as to have some kind of, again, I'm repeating this, Muslim state, but as a remainder of Bosnia. So that's something which was created by the international community, by the European community, and to the present day has never been abandoned. This non-paper that we were talking about before in the introduction, allegedly launched by the Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša, but in reality probably launched by some circles within the European Union, only given to Janša to publish or publicize. So I would say that this non-paper is just an attempt to push things further in direction of what was designed at the Lisbon Conference at the first moment, that is to partition Bosnia for good, to cede parts to Serbia and Croatia, and leave a small Muslim republic or Muslim statelet within. Even if you take that so-called Muslim statelet, we had very interesting experiences during the war that foreign powers, namely Great Britain, they were importing mujahedeens from Arab countries, Wahhabis, and so on, trying to redesign and redefine the Muslim identity of Bosnian Muslims, trying to make them Wahhabis, trying to make them extreme, and so on. So it was a very strange game. I would say that, of course, we had our participants in that. All these leaders of ethno-nationalist parties were very willing to participate because they were well paid for that. They got their territories to control the resources. They became almost statesmen. So they had their motives to participate, but practically the entire pattern was imported. We in Bosnia were really surprised at the time. A couple of us, including Adnan Idrisbegovic and myself, we were among the first to have realized what was actually going on, that the international community imported these concepts with their own motives to create some kind of ethno-nationalist pure territories as a result of ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing was also a part of this plan to implement the Lisbon maps. It was impossible due to the mix of the population in Bosnia. All the religious groups, all the ethnic groups were so intermixed. So you had to organize ethnic cleansing in order to implement the Lisbon maps. So the war had to be organized in the form of ethnic cleansing to create these ethnically cleansed territories. So they obviously wanted to introduce that pattern. They probably wanted to introduce yet another pattern, that one of the clash of civilizations, so-called, that it is necessary for Muslims and Christians to fight each other. In Bosnia, they never fought each other before, but all of a sudden we got the pattern that we must fight one against another, and that there is nothing else that we can do but fight for territories. But I want to emphasize that once you introduce the pattern of ethnically pure territories, ethnically cleansed territories as a pattern for creation of nation states, then you get a war, then you get a conflict. There is no other solution. you have to ethnically clean those or cleanse those territories in order to follow and implement the pattern. So that is what we got in Bosnia, and now we have to deal with it. We have to somehow restore the sovereignty of Bosnia, to restore it from these ethno-nationalist parties which still control it. Each controls its own part of the territory and they pretend to have their own states. There are, of course, people who want to restore the sovereignty of Bosnia, but it is very difficult to do that given the fact that we still have this pressure from the outside, from the international community to actually partition the country and so on. And I have to emphasize that it mainly comes from Europe. The US behaved in a different way, I have to emphasize that. They did it in Dayton as well. They wanted to protect the external boundaries of Bosnia. They wanted to keep the borders intact, and that's something which I have to emphasize. They didn't have too many ideas of how to organize the state, what to do with sovereignty and so on, but they wanted the borders intact. And that was the basic conflict between the US and the European countries, primarily Great Britain and France, who wanted the partition of Bosnia to be finalized. So to the present day, we have this kind of problem. And we have, of course, domestic traitors, I don't have a better word for that, who want to partition the country and want to cede parts to Serbia and Croatia, or to create a small Muslim statelet for their own purposes. So whatever we are trying to do to restore the sovereignty, we still have the problem. The last remainder of the Bosnian sovereignty is kept in the so-called Office of the High Representative. So the only institution which can actually impose its will on the entire territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina is this one. So it's the High Representative, so-called, of the international community. And he's not doing his job these days. In the last 10 years, he hasn't imposed any decisions and so on. But we have to say that actually abolishing the institution of the High Representative would abolish the last remainder of the Bosnian sovereignty. Then the entities, the ethnic entities, would become independent states and would cede to Serbia and Croatia. And then we would have what was planned in Lisbon long time ago. So we have to fight to keep this institution before we actually create a new constitution in which we will try to restore the sovereignty of the state of Bosnia. So that's something which is ahead of us, and we have to try to do that. We hopefully have some kind of support by the US in that, although it is not really too explicit. I have to mention that too. But on the other hand, we have the European powers which still want to partition Bosnia and create ethnically cleansed territories in the Balkans. And I would say that there are similar things happening with the Ukraine, and that there are also participants from the West who actually want to see Russia doing these things and want to see Ukraine partitioned as well. I even spoke with some Russian diplomats who told me so, that they were offered, that Russia was offered by the West to partition Ukraine, and they didn't want it. They wanted to keep Ukraine fractured as a buffer zone between Russia and the West rather than to partition it for good. So that's what I wanted to say in introduction. I apologize if I was a bit longer than planned, but I at least hope that it was not boring for you. So now, Mykhailo, take the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Hadžidedić. Absolutely great and interesting speech. I think that it will create a lot of questions and reactions and discussions. I would say that we in Ukraine actually trying to make a partition of Russia. So this is our pattern of next future. But so to make a discussion and provoke next discussions. Now I'd like to make my speech to make a comparison of the Ukrainian point of view. Actually, it's my point of view, but I'd like to present maybe some generalization of moods and understanding of the situation from Ukrainian side, what is happening and what could be in next decade. So I'll try to start with general picture, and after this go to Ukrainian understanding of Ukrainian geopolitics and the situation in the region. So if we're talking about the general situation, I think that the world is moving towards a total change of the model of its further development. Even now, it's impossible to say what kind of picture of new international order we will see. I think that it's possible to say that it hasn't been determined yet. The main drivers of next civilization, I think it's United States and China, and they are trying to find a new balance of power and geopolitical interests between them. And this process is accompanied by the restructuring of Euro-Atlantic, European and Eurasian economic and security spaces. Western European countries in this time, primarily France and Germany, trying to commit to the idea of strategic autonomy. That means military and political independence from the United States, but practical sources of moving towards this goal are uncertain yet. Such strategy requires in-depth review of basic principles of European Union and NATO functioning. And in addition, Western Europe is quite seriously considering Russia as a leverage in competition between EU, China, and the United States. It's very interesting, but talking with, for example, Germany politicians and experts, they very often using Russia and the capability of Russia as an instrument in competition with China and United States. And sometimes then Russians trying to say that they are great power. I think they should ask in Germany what German thinks about Russia in the same time. So Europe's efforts to answer the purpose of nowadays challenges are leading to the blurring the traditional EU value system. It brings about the transition to the so-called realpolitik model of international relations based on cynical pragmatism and narrow national interest. Therefore, it comes into collision with an image of European Union as a common space for the harmonious development of European nations on the basis of democratic values. At the same time, 30 years after the collapse of Soviet Union, we are witnessing the next transformation of the post-Soviet space. Russia's war against Ukraine and Georgia, the occupation of Transnistrian region of Republic of Moldova, the crisis in Belarus, Nagorno-Karabakh, it's only a facade of these processes. Current political and economic developments in Russia indicate that the post-imperial country is one of the now in the eve of its internal transformation and fragmentation. In my opinion, NATO, in the same time, refrains from taking responsibility and leadership in the wider European region, especially in the post-Soviet space, talking especially about the relationship and situation in our region now on the, just in real time, we have military preparations of Russia for next attack against Ukraine. In this situation, NATO in the European Union, I think they trying to be out of the our conflict and try to be out of the next collision and controversial situation between Ukraine and Russia. And I think it's a mistake. The alliance relies on the traditional approach of ensuring collective defense, focusing on the Euro-Atlantic internal stability. And thus, unwillingness to act proactively and take responsibility for the regional and global stability. will result in the growth of external threats and dominance of destructive actors. The world is on the verge of crucial shift. Not the international law or international organization or even international order now works properly. And the rules of war have almost lost their original meaning. The monopoly of use of military force is not the exclusive prerogative of states anymore. Transnational corporations, oligarchs, criminals, sometimes together with Secret Service, got opportunity to use their own quasi-military units, so-called private military companies and other proxies to take advantage of military forces on their own interests. And all of this hybrid reality, as I could say, creates a hybrid understanding of the situation, because it's very difficult now to say what's actually happening in traditional understanding of international relations, of international law. Looking at the Black Sea or Azov Sea close to Ukraine, it's Ukrainian water, but under control of Russia, because Russia has a force to put their own rules there. And nobody, even NATO now, trying to do something against this. So I'm afraid that we are shifting to some kind of 18th century relationship between countries, and rule of force will create a new space and a new environment, new ecosystem for all of us. I mean, the countries, regions, and especially in Eastern Europe, in Southern Europe, which is under 1,000 years of influence and impact of other players. Now about Ukrainian geopolitics. A little bit of history. For more than 1,000 years, Ukraine are the crossroads on the grand chessboard of international politics. Regional and grand powers always were struggling to shape Ukraine as own territory. Nevertheless, Ukrainian endemic field is obviously pretty strong. So after even 1,000 of this struggling, after the Kiev Rus was a powerful state, Ukrainian national territory is approximately the same now. At least the Ukrainian national territory of with international recognized borders. What is interesting that even about name of Ukraine, we have a permanent conflict. In Soviet Union and Russia, they have the myth that Ukraine means Ukraina. I'd like to say that this is not Ukrainian word, Ukraina. Ukraina is a Russian word. And Russians translated this as a borderlands, periphery, or frontier region. But if you look at the map, the biggest country in Europe now, I'm not sure that this is borderland. And in reality, the base of word of name of Ukraine is another word. It's Kraina. I think that our Bosnian friends would understand what this means. It's a country. So in the same time, I'm sure that name of Rus was just stolen by Moscow during the hard times for Kiev. And actually, that's why Moscovians and or modern Russians, they always trying to say that Ukrainians doesn't exist at all. So this is our historical problems, one of them. For last 30 years, it was the next period of self-identification of Ukraine, and Ukraine was trying to find own place in new world after collapse of the Soviet Union, changing from neutrality to pro-Russian course, again to multi-vector policy, after to NATO aspirations, after to neutrality again. Ukraine changed several times the geopolitical views, or the strategical geopolitical views of the country and the aspirations for self-development. I'm not sure it was geopolitics. That was like chaotic transformation of the part of the former part of the Soviet Union. And it was disaster for nation which stuck in the gray zone between West and East. It was really very hard times. Everything has been changed in 2014 when Ukrainian people protested against pro-Russian policy of President Yanukovych. It was again the next changing of the Ukrainian geopolitics from the NATO aspirations since 2005-2010. Since 2010, when Yanukovych arrived to the office, Ukraine again started to be build a pro-Russian state. So Ukrainian people started to protest against the pro-Russian policy of Yanukovych. This decision was against geopolitical interests of Russia, and Russia attacked Ukraine with military force and then hybrid means. We're trying to, we could discuss these meanings of these operations. I think it was normal military operations with using of secret services and special forces, but okay, basically we're always talking about hybrid instruments and of attack by Russia, and Russia trying to return Ukraine to the zone of all influence, but result wasn't so successful and what Russia expects actually. Russia did not occupy all of Ukraine, which was the original goal of the operation, and did not change Ukrainian aspiration to the NATO and the EU, even make it stronger, but illegally annexed Crimea and occupied part of the Donbass, which from my point of view is deep and long trap for Russia, international trap for Russia. And after Putin, Russia obviously will pay for these war crimes. In the same time, it's a paradox, but Russian aggression helped Ukrainian people to start process of active self-identification as a United Nation and crystallized all national interest. From this time, Ukraine is trying to be a subject of international relations and design all geopolitics, which could be an instrument to achieve national goals. From my point of view, Ukraine should have not naive but pragmatic geopolitics now, oriented on the last trend for realpolitik, which is pretty popular in the world, in Europe now, but of course in the frame of international law. Now, my several points on the forecast and new Ukrainian geopolitics. What should be a Ukrainian geopolitics in next 5-10 years? First of all, to build allied relations out of the NATO till Ukraine become the member of this organization, because always we have a problem of lack of political will inside of NATO to make a step toward Ukraine. So we should build allied relations out of the NATO with United States, Canada, UK, Poland, Baltic states, Romania, and Turkey. Second, to build around Ukraine the belt of good neighborhood. It's a called good neighborhood. It means to secure as positive as possible relationship with all Ukrainian neighbors and even more, like Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, and Turkey. Unfortunately, Belarus now is actually should be the closest nation to Ukraine. Now is under control of Lukashenko and Russia, so it's impossible to build normal relations this time. My forecast for next 5 years, Russia will continue to try to destroy Ukraine as an independent state using hybrid instruments and military blackmail for Ukraine and West. So geopolitical tension around Ukraine will increase. Conflicts with Russia will determine geopolitical situation in the region. Ukraine should act proactive to create allied relations and positive neighborhood. In the same time, internal resilience and military force will play critical importance for Ukraine. Russia will be in the process of internal transformation after Putin. So our region should be united and ready to react effectively on any development at the East. Thank you for your time, and I think that now we could open discussions, and I'd like to propose to have a floor to our discussants, our excellent discussants. I think I can propose to be a first to Dr. Adnan Huskić from Sarajevo School of Science and Technology. Dr. Huskić, what do you think about the our points of view? I mean, the Dr. Hadžidedić and mine about the geopolitics in our region and comparison. Actually, we have a different points of view, definitely. But I hope that our discussants will try to find the maybe joint framework to try to build joint understanding what we should do in next time.
Thank you, Mykhailo. I mean, I listened to your and Zlatko's presentation with much interest, and I find them both very interesting. You covered, as you rightly pointed out, things from two different angles, and each in his own field of expertise. What I would like to address are some of your general assessments concerning the situation, and perhaps offer a thing or two of my own thoughts when it comes to this. I would say that one of the things that we need to recognize when we speak about Ukraine and Bosnia, even though these two countries in very many aspects couldn't be more different from one another. Ukraine is a relatively large country. Bosnia is relatively small. There are a number of other things where we differ in terms of understanding who we are and our position in the world, but there are also several striking similarities, if you want me to put them this way. The first one is this unfortunate geopolitical position, and I guess this some of it, and I'm not going to venture into a distant past when it comes to this, but some of it has to do with historical developments of two countries, how they came into existence, and what kind of influences have in a way been prevalent in the course of their histories, which determine who they are today. More recently, however, one of the things that I think should be really pointed out is that both countries have emerged, especially at the end of the Cold War, and the dissolution of Soviet Union and dissolution of Yugoslavia, which happened as part of this process, emerged in an environment, an atmosphere which was, I would say, in particular when it comes to global configuration, was, I would say, filled with hope in terms of the future course for both countries. I would even say perhaps a bit naive reliance on how the international system will continue to function after the end of the bipolar world. Now, for instance, you can refer to Bosnia's a very intricate setup, which involves foreign actors on the ground as active actors, but also decision and policy makers. And I would say if you have leverages from steering the country from outside, you also have to rely on the situation to remain, or the global and regional configuration to remain relatively stable over time, which wasn't the case. Ukraine was also relying on an international law, on the existence of norms in this newly emerging system at the end of the bipolar world. However, what I think we were, and I'm really trying to use these words carefully, but I think that our naivety, and I think it's rightly described as such now in retrospective, because it's visible, relying on internationally binding agreements, relying on international norms, and not on the language of force, domination, and power. we shouldn't really think of ourselves as being on the wrong side of this argument. I'm always opting for more regulation and more stricter norms on an international level, and more reliance on multilateralism rather than anything else. But what we're obviously facing, and this is why we are having discussions like this, what we're obviously facing is markedly different situation compared to the one we had at the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the two states from underneath the states which disappeared. And this is now the situation where, especially when we think about perspectives for the future, right? We need to take a few steps back. When I say a few steps back, of course, I'm referring to, I would say, a historical distance in all this. As much as we were naive in thinking that, you know, whatever emerged immediately after the end of the Cold War was a new multipolar, multilateral world with the dominance of the Western style of liberal democracy is going to be or will represent in a way basis for future developments. This is not something that was shared by some authors in the East. In particular, when we look at some of the emerging countries, Russia, Turkey, for instance, what some of them were seeing is actually the situation where the dust hasn't settled yet, and is only beginning to settle now in this later period for the past decade or so. Now we see what they believe now, and I'm saying taking a few steps back, what we're seeing is a different geopolitical configuration. What we're obviously suffering from at this stage, and what is obviously something that in a way undermines the progress of the two countries is weakening of Western normative and geopolitical influence, which is evident in the way the Western world, and of course you can address it from different, or you should, of course, talk about different countries. We can talk about the United States, we can talk about the Europe, and then individual countries within Europe when we talk about this. But let's say just the Western influence in terms of what it was at the end of how it was perceived at the end of the Cold War is obviously losing ground. Now, this is not something I say with any joy, on the contrary, but this needs to be recognized, because so far, what I think, and you know, in my opening statement before we started, when I spoke about this perception of Russia as being omnipotent, someone who can, you know, who's pulling strings globally and influencing events globally, what I actually am seeing is a lot of disorientation in the West, a lot of confusion, which then somehow, you know, us as a pattern-seeking animals, you know, you're always trying to find the easiest way to describe why this is happening, what are the reasons behind this. What we're seeing is an empty space left behind this, I would say, the Western advance. And unfortunately for us, we are at the periphery of this advance. What I think has happened is, in a way, you know, the story about the NATO expansion and the Russia and apparently the gentleman's agreement. NATO will not expand westward, and then, you know, that the kind of compromise or deal collapsed. And what we're actually seeing is the situation where NATO itself, or the commitment to collective security within NATO, is something that I think very many analysts are questioning, you know, to what extent we can really talk about this commitment. Most recently, this was a question asked by especially the Baltic states. There were some very problematic statements from former American president in this sense, especially when referring to Montenegro and what's happening there right now. I think that we are unfortunately still in the process. I'm talking, when you talk about the trajectory of where all of this is going, I think we're still in the process of declining or phase out of the Western influence, which means that for me the outlook is actually negative. The way I see it right now is unconsolidated Western presence with a number of neuralgic points that they need to address within the EU, the future of the EU. So the EU is, when we talk about that particular actor, EU is for the times being, and I would say probably until 22 or even 23, depending when this discussion on the future of Europe or the future setup of Europe will be concluded, is going to be very limited in terms of its ability to influence things at the border. Not to mention the fact that some countries in the European Union are not really fond of sanctions against Russia. I would like to see the kind of Russia-EU rapprochement as the possible way out. I'm not saying that this is a bad idea necessarily, but something to be taken into account. The United States is, I would say, in the state of foreign policy disorientation, which only culminated with during Trump administration. But I think it was in making, because, for instance, in Bosnia, their presence is generally, or their approach is hands-off since 2006. You know, and up until that time, they were, if not the most important, then definitely the most visible foreign actor on the ground. And ultimately, the questions within the European Union, all the open questions within the European Union, all the problems with the West, and this is my final point, I would say excessive reliance on the West in this sense. Now, this of course leads to certain frustrations. I think, you know, and I've said this at several meetings with colleagues from the West and the diplomats, that this is that there is the frustration on both sides. You know, we are not meeting in a way their expectations, and they are not meeting our expectations. But I think that we actually don't understand each other very well. What I was actually hoping for, and I'm talking more about the region now, I don't think that I can make assessment of the sort or predictions of the sort when it comes to Ukraine, because of the very complex geopolitical situation there, both domestic and also domestic complexities. I was kind of hoping that this realization that we are living in a volatile and turbulent period will result with us developing agency of the sort. I'm talking about us as the region here, realizing that we are once again in the middle of reshuffle on the global scale, and the reshuffle on the global scale for us has never in history brought anything good. So developing more agency would be necessary. However, I'm also I think that the outlook is relatively negative there as well. Now, I wouldn't like to draw any conclusions at this stage. I would like to also give floor to colleagues and give room to colleagues to say what they mean. I'm just trying to add more meat to the overall discussion, so that we know where we stand in terms of the position of our two countries. And I'm not going to go. I mean, Zlatko covered pretty much the the domestic complexities in Bosnia. There is no need to venture there. But I think that both countries, as I said, even though they are relatively distant from one another and relatively different from one another, there are several striking similarities. And I don't think that the outlook for the time being is positive in terms of how this will develop from now on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huskić. I think you made a great job. I mean to integrate our two reports. I mean the speeches with Zlatko, and set the scene for next discussion. I think that you told about frustration, naiveness, suffering from the hope on the Western countries. It's absolutely about our both countries. I would say that. With name of Budapest Memorandum, which just rising the great frustration about the Ukrainian naiveness. We thought that the gentleman signing in 1994 the assurance for Ukrainian security instead of nuclear warheads we thought that it could work. It doesn't work at all, and we've got the problems now. Even now we're talking about it. Let's activate Budapest Memorandum. Okay, let's activate, but without the UK and the United States, it's impossible to do it. And I'm not sure that United States and United Kingdom they are going to activate their commitments, because it's a lot of responsibility actually. And one more time, it's Bucharest NATO summit 2008, when actually we've got the member action plan together with Georgia, but Putin arrived personally to the summit and arranged a situation against our interest, because Germany and France played their own game. And it was very interesting that during these 30 years, Ukrainians just started to understand. It was paradoxical, it was a surprise for a lot of Ukrainians that Germany has own interest, UK has own interest, US own interest, and Ukraine should have own interest, and not rely on the romantic understanding of not even geopolitics, but international relations. Now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Sienkiewicz from Ukraine, and give her possibility and opportunity to give our to give the opportunity to integrate our two speeches, mine and Zlatko. Katerina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I speak about thesis of Dr. Hadžidedić about Lisbon Conference and Dayton Agreement. It's a very interesting thesis about similar, and I agree with you that thesis that European representatives discussed in Lisbon in 1992, then next peace plan during 1993 and 1994 and 1995 discussed in this borders. Then all theses discussed in a conference in 1992 discussed in Dayton 95, and maybe discuss now when last week in media published so-called non-paper document about a new order and new borders in Western Balkans. I think that a very difficult and interesting situation in Bosnia, and some points in maybe use in Minsk and Russia use for Ukraine. I think that Bosnia and Ukraine very similar and very different, because we have similar geopolitical interest, and we and our every country imagine in world as a crossroads in regions, and it's stereotypes imagination of every countries. So Bosnia and Ukraine difference because internal and external situation in every country different, and influence external actors very different. In Bosnia, very influenced Turkish, European and American actors. In Ukrainian, influence Russia and European Union. But next or last week, last years, very influence USA, but its influence don't constantly and have some sporadically interest in Ukrainian, but situation exchange when election in USA and new president have interest in Ukraine and in Ukrainian conflict with Russia. In Ukrainian last years use and speak in media and experts about so-called Bosnian variant regular conflict in Donbass and in Crimea. Its experts told that Bosnian variant can use for legislation Donbass People Republic and Lugansk People Republic, and I think that it's possible for Russia legislation this separatist group, and the Bosnian variant is very need for Putin and Russian political groups. So forecast for maybe 5 or 10 years, I think that Ukrainian and Bosnia has a problem with Russia, because Russia in Bosnia constantly destabilization political and economic situation, especially it in Republika Srpska, and in Ukrainian Russia destabilization situation in occupied territory and Crimea, and in other territory from media, from Facebook and other methods control Ukrainian society. I think that in Bosnia and Ukraine grows influence China, Turkey and USA, and it's difference from Ukraine. In Ukraine, China and USA have a sporadically policy. In Bosnia, this great actors have more influence, and in different spheres, especially energy and political spheres. And I think in Bosnia influence of European Union weak and Bosnia will can to join EU, but it's not very direction in foreign policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to give a little bit of fresh of our discussion, we have a question from the audience from Ruslana Kochmar, and she's asking about the role of Russians in our both countries. I'd like to read it. Actually, you could read it from the chat, and maybe it will be a question for our next discussants. So basically, the question about that Putin backs Bosnia's Serbs and the President Milorad Dodik. He views that as guarantees against Bosnian membership in NATO and the European Union. The same situation is occurring in Ukraine. As you know, this puts Russia and the US in the spotlight. So don't you think that without a new dialogue format involving the US, first of all, it would be impossible to counter provocations by Russia? Of course, the main issue with Ukraine conflict is a sequence of implementation of Minsk agreement, but how would we convince Russia to conduct free and fair Eastern elections, plus withdrawal of the military forces and considering conservation of only temporary status for people republics. I can answer for the second part of the question about the Minsk agreement because I'm a pretty expert on it, and I would say that the problem with Minsk agreement really it's the consequences of the points of its implementation. From Ukrainian part of the understanding of this agreement, the firstly should be a security points. So it means that withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, the control of Ukrainian-Russian border, and only after this we can conduct the elections and put the law and order of Ukrainian law and order. From a Russian point of view, firstly, it should be the elections, the changes in Ukrainian constitution and law, and only after this, Russia will withdraw in forces and give us the control over the border, which is absolutely against of Ukrainian, at least, logic. No, I'm not so sure that totally logic, but Ukrainian logic. So I think that basically these two different point of view, it means that deadlock of the Minsk agreement, and I think that we don't have any real possibility to implement this agreement without its modernization. And I agree, this modernization could be organized by the joining different countries like United States, Poland, Canada, UK, or other participants, because I think that Normandy format is too comfortable, too warm ecosystem for Russia, because Germany and France, it's not the real, let's say, moderator, but mostly it's a country which is playing own interests. And of course, in this situation, Russia is using absolutely great and successful situation in Minsk agreement. Now I'd like to propose the floor to Dr. Igor. Okay, Igor,
yeah.
for 2 minutes.
Yeah, just a small reflection on your speech and the speech of our Bosnian colleagues. So first, you mentioned that it's a big mistakes of NATO, of the West, that it is avoiding more involvement in Ukrainian-Russian conflict. But I would like to say that West not only it tries to, especially NATO, tries to avoid involvement directly into our conflict, but also in the wider Black Sea region at all, because we can see that that disbalance of the NATO presence in the Eastern Europe between North Pass and South Pass, southern part, comparing Baltic states, Poland, and to this Romania and Bulgaria still continues. And we can say that, as Mr. Huskić said, that Russia has initiative in the game with the West, and while watching on the situation in the Black Sea region, we can see that West took this the rules of the games which were proposed, let's say, proposed by Russia. As for the situation in Bosnia, there were two very interesting opinions. First, told by Mr. Hadžidedić, about that. It was very interesting for me to hear that the Great Britain and France, that the European Union, has the interest in this so-called non-paper to start the division, or to finalize the division of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But at the same time, you mentioned that it, and this is true, that it has the threat that it could lead to the war on the terrain of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the question to me, it seems a bit no logic that European Union shouldn't be interested in war in the region which is on its southern border of the European Union. At the same time, you mentioned nothing or very slightly about Russian interests. So as we see, and from our experience in Ukraine, so the main part of the external part in the situation in Bosnia that would like to see some kind of war or destabilization in the country, in the region at all, that will will be the consequences of the destabilization in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is Russia. To split, to divide, and to rule. You know, but the main idea not to destabilize the Bosnian Russians, as I see, and I think a lot of people in Ukraine and our Ukrainian, my colleagues agree with me. So the main idea, not just is the main purpose of Russia is not the only Bosnia and Herzegovina, and not even the Balkans, but the European Union and the West. To destabilize the West, to destabilize Europe by creating destabilization on its southern borders. So as Mr. Huskić said about some kind of disorientation in Washington regarding the relations with Bosnia and Herzegovina, what I heard that before 2 years ago, for the West, there were three unresolved problems here in the Balkans. First was North Macedonian membership NATO. Second, the Serbian and Kosovo, and third is stabilization of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And after the change of the administration in Washington, the main task of the Balkan policy of Joe Biden would be the stabilization of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that might be the main task for the new administration in Washington. And I will say that this is, no, I don't want to say that this is not some kind of truth or someone is wrong or someone is right, but it's another point, and it's rather interesting to me, and I would like to hear your opinions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor.
A little bit, 2 minutes, but
okay, I absolutely agree that Western countries, NATO, EU, they don't have any strategy. It's true, absolutely true, and that's why Russia has. Okay, yeah. Maybe this is strategy. Do not have strategy, but for example, for the NATO, I understand that they don't have the strategy in Black Sea, for example, to act proactively, and maybe this is a strategy to have pay attention to the internal stability of the NATO instead of the external stability of the region. So to be fair, I'm giving floor to Mr. Idrisbegović, and please, Zlatko, keep in mind the questions of by Igor Fedik, and after the Mr. Idrisbegović, I will give floor to Dr. Hadžidedić. Okay, so floor for Mr. Idrisbegović for answering these questions and previous questions, please.
Okay, first, greetings to all. Second, I don't want to sound very pretentious, but I think you are having same illusions as we used to have at the beginning and during our war. Unfortunately, reality is not black or white. It's not a color, it's a gray, different shades of gray. What I can see in media and what I can hear from you is that you have slightly simplistic perception of reality. Russians are our enemy, NATO are our friends.
Turn on the microphone, please. Yeah.
The Russians are not as much hostile to Ukraine, nor the Western NATO is so friendly to you. Basically, they want to keep Ukraine in a position which semantically in old interpretation means borderlands, battlefield. We understand that Ukrainians want to get out from this denomination. It's very rational. No one wants to be a cannon fodder between two sides. In this moment of time, in this post-factual reality, we are witnessing the situation when, after destructing the multilateral world, the security architecture built after the Second World War, America is seeking to return back to comfort zone of a bipolar world. The problem is, world has changed dramatically. America is not as powerful as it was. NATO is not as powerful as it was. There are new major players on the scene. The problem for Ukraine today, as it once was for us, is to perceive reality as it is, not as we like it to be. We have had a very different experiences with our Western partners. We have a very ambivalent relation to European Union after the experience we have had with them. In the same time, European Union today suffer from the identity crisis. They don't know what they are and they don't know what they want to become. All they know is that European Union has been created as an American strategic development during the Cold War. Today's Europe don't know where to go. They are simply too big. They are simply economically too strong. They are, in the same time, politically very weak. On the other side, our experience with Americans is far more positive. While the European Union offered us a rhetorical support at the beginning of the war, they were massively engaged in partition of Bosnia behind the screen. Americans, on the other side, have been supportive first rhetorically, and when the things starting to aggravate, they have started to intervene, first discreetly and later on openly. Ukrainian problem is that it lies on unfortunate place as we are. You are a real borderland again, but the borderland between two empires. And both sides intend to create a buffer zone out of Ukraine. That means you will bleed for the interest of others. The only way of Ukraine to avoid such a position is to develop a national, rational-based strategy that will serve Ukrainian interests only. Otherwise, you will be reduced to a mere tool of this or that side. As I can understand, you have a more or less two potential allies. First is Turkey, because due to internal NATO dynamics, European forces are pushing Turkey out of NATO as much as they can. And that creates a window of opportunity where both Ukraine and Turkey will have a very similar strategic position. You share the Black Sea, and I found the Turks to be far more reliable partner than European Union will ever become to Ukraine. I think you have already had some experiences in this regard. Problem with European Union is that it is a very composite structure. It does not have a single will on the foreign political field, nor insecurity anymore. You have also witnessed how Germany has developed Nord Stream 1 and 2 to satisfy its energetic needs at expense of European Union energy strategy and at expense of Ukraine. You can envisage a situation in the future that Ukraine will be under pressure to accept the reality on the field, as they used to tell to us. You cannot rely on international law or order. It does not exist anymore. That's unfortunate reality. The Americans at their peak of power has decided that they can go further and that they can dismantle the system as much as it fits to their interests. It has started in George Bush Sr. era and ended with the Trump. Trump almost destroyed entire architecture. What will come with Biden, we will see. We cannot predict. So you can be in a situation that someone in Europe find out that their priority is to solve their security situation in Baltics and to exchange or try to exchange Kaliningrad for Crimea. It's cheap. It's Ukrainian, it's far south, they should settle their own problem. This is reality. America, on the other hand, really seeks the comfort of bipolar world. However, we have China, we have several emerging states that will play a major role in the near future. And we are unfortunately living in the age of insecurity. Nobody knows what will follow. But with a little experience, we cannot hope for the better, at least for some time. I hope I have contributed to this interesting conversation. So my suggestion is rely on yourself. That's the best you can do, and that will give you a lever to solve the problem. It's not easy, it will not be easy, and it will not be the cheap solution. I will now return to Russia. From my point of view, Russia behaved very differently to our warring factions. Our war was a typical territorial war when two sides, with support of European Union states, wanted to settle their problems on our expense. I don't think Russia, besides the Crimea, intends to occupy Ukraine. I don't think they can afford all-out war with Ukraine. Russian economy is very weak. So they will not risk all-out conflict with Ukraine. What their intention is to keep Ukraine out of European and NATO integrations. They cannot afford to have Ukraine in NATO. It's strategic reality. And if you force them, then they will have to consider a serious all-out attack on Ukraine. So far, I would recommend for the Ukraine leadership to use the time wisely. Do whatever you can to stabilize your economy. Invest in development. Use the opportunity your relations with West offers to you. Technological advance is very important. Try to reach a technological edge over Russians. They will carefully monitor what is going on, but they will not act unless provoked. They cannot afford it. The recent amazement of troops was communications with Americans. The root was fear, nothing else. They were afraid that the West, the Americans, will do something insane. They were afraid that Ukraine troops will try to regain Donbas and Luhansk. I share that opinion of Russians. I think that Ukrainian army, which has been seriously improved compared to the beginning of the war, was intending to do something in this region. Russians were afraid of it. Their reaction was just to show we will fight for it, but it was not meant or sent to Ukraine. It was sent to America only. European Union does not play in that game. So whatever you do, use your time. Improve whatever you can. And you know, in military strategy, it's called exchanging a time for space or vice versa. They have occupied a small area in Ukraine that is painfully important for you because of the energy and industry located there, but it still allows Ukraine to operate freely in other sections. You can do a lot, but you have to restructure your state within. And I can recommend you not to repeat our mistakes. protect your institutions. Absolutely. Not individuals, not special groups, not interest groups, not political party. The power of Ukraine lies in institutions. The justice sector is absolutely a no-go. If you lose the control, like we did, of our justice system, you will be in a serious peril. So much from me. I hope I have said something reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herzegowina. Yeah, absolutely agree with you on several points. And so, first of all, that we should use our time. And as you told, the Ukrainian armed forces at least use this time effectively. And if Russians are afraid that Ukraine will regain the territory, actually, this is one of the tasks of Ukrainian armed forces to regain the territorial integrity. This fear should be with Russians always, every minute. And I agree absolutely with you that mainly that military demonstration was a communication with Biden administration to try to build a new line of communication and maybe to bargain new reset as with Obama administration. I'm not sure that it will be the same reset like that time, but anyway, Putin is very hopes on this reset and you bargain on different problems. I will give you Ukraine, you will give me the Northern Stream 2, I will give you Middle East, Balkans, whatever. I hope that actually it wouldn't be easy for Putin at least. And one more, what I like to react that in 2014 Putin made a huge mistake because he shouldn't attack military. And if he didn't attack military, I think he would be successful. But his intelligence was very ineffective, and they told him that Ukraine doesn't exist at all. This is failed state, and we can get Crimea without any consequences. We can get these territories. We can get. They try to. Yeah, I'm absolutely sure. I'm talking that in that time, in April, May 2014, they were ready to get Kharkiv territory from Kharkiv to Odessa, which is a half of Ukraine, and only resistance from Ukrainian institutions like police, for example, and militaries and of course society in Kharkiv and Odessa, they stopped the same scenario like in Donetsk, because Donetsk, Lugansk, they use the so-called paramilitary rebels without any insignias. They told that this is Ukrainians. The same scenario were used in Kharkiv, in Odessa, in Kherson, in Mariupol. Actually, Mariupol was occupied for a couple months, and in May, I think it was May 15 or 13, the Ukrainian armed forces regained the city just because they started to fight. But in Donetsk and Lugansk, unfortunately, they won the time and won the territory. But again, I think that Putin made a huge mistake for all of these moves, because if he used the hybrid, or let's say other methods like to buy politicians, to use corruption, to use different instruments, how often use Russians in Ukraine, I think they made more success than by military means. And now we have this situation when Russians should communicate with Ukraine only with military instruments, and communicate with United States regarding Ukraine only with military means, but not with other. Now I'd like to give the floor to Anatoly Demishuk to make a full circle of.
So wasn't I supposed to reply to?
Okay, Zlatko. Anatoly, sorry, we'll give you the floor to Zlatko.
No problem, sure.
too eager to answer. Okay.
All right.
Is yours.
Of course, it is easy to present the world in black and white categories, as Adnan said. And I'm afraid that you still suffer from that kind of approach as we did in 1992. It is easy to blame Russia for everything, you know, especially if the Western propaganda says so, then you say, well, yes, that's the truth. That's something we have to accept. And if we follow their ideas, then we will be on the right side of history. No, it's not like that. We had such experience as I described, and I have to say, in response to Igor, that Russian engagement in Bosnia-Herzegovina is of the very, very, very recent date, in the last couple of years. It means that the Russians actually accepted the rules of the game, because from the beginning of the war in Bosnia, we were being told, and the entire world was being told, that Russia was, you know, behind the Serbs. No, Russians were starving at the time, as did Ukrainians, sorry. So it was a complete lie that was supposed to present the image of the world in terms of the clash of civilizations. Now I have to warn you, Ukraine is on the dividing line between two civilizations, between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. You are within Huntington's plan of how to push the world into a conflict. And so did we, or so are we. We are on the dividing line between the Eastern and Western Christianity and Islam. So it's even more complex. That was the idea from the beginning, to create hotspots of conflict between these supposedly called civilizations, represented by proxy states, such as Serbia and Croatia represented Eastern and Western Christianity, or Bosnia representing Islam. In Ukraine, they want to create a similar pattern that is about Eastern and Western Christianity, and so on. The Russians in Bosnia accepted the game. There were no Russians when we were attacked by Serbia. Serbia only had support by the UK and France. And the rest of the EU was tacitly approving of what they were doing in terms of the partition and ethnic cleansing. As for whether the UK has an interest in having conflicts or wars on the European territory, yes, of course they do. There is a very important work, I'm sure that Mykhailo is very much aware of it, by Halford Mackinder, the founder of the British Geopolitics, who practically proposed that the UK and later the US, in alliance with the UK, could control the entire world by creating conflicts in so-called semi-periphery in the Eurasian continent. He saw the entire world as Eurasia and Africa as the world's island, and Britain controlling the world seas, maritime trade, and in military terms. The Americans more or less adopted this very idea, and they control the world in a similar way, so as to create conflicts within Eurasia, so as to prevent the major powers in Eurasia, such as Russia and Germany or Russia and China, to become allies and to unify Eurasia into a single geopolitical space. So that's the story behind. Russia has adopted the rules of the game, now is entering Bosnia, but not to occupy Bosnia or control Bosnia or do anything like that. They don't care about Bosnia. They don't care about Serbia. The only thing the Russians care about is Ukraine. They are using Bosnia in exchange for Ukraine to send a message to the West that if the West wants to really enter Ukraine with NATO, then they are going to keep Bosnia and Serbia under pressure and leave them out of NATO. At a certain point in time, they would propose an exchange. We will leave you Bosnia and Serbia back, and you get out of Ukraine. That's what the Russians want to do. As simple as that. Of course, it doesn't look like that, but I'm aware that Mykhailo believes that they wanted to occupy the whole of Ukraine and so on, but I'm pretty sure that they just wanted a part of Ukraine to fracture the Ukrainian territory so as to prevent it from entering NATO. That's their only goal. And they cannot afford Ukraine becoming a part of NATO. Then you will have the World War. If Ukraine wants to enter NATO, you will have a war on the Ukrainian territory, but not a war between Ukraine and Russia, but the World War. The Third World War will be fought on the territory of Ukraine if you really want to enter NATO. Russia cannot afford it, and all they are doing in the Balkans is just to send a message that they can press in the Balkans if NATO really wants to enter Ukraine. They are actually proposing exchange. We will leave the Balkans, you leave Ukraine. That's the whole story. And again, the US, following these UK patterns in geopolitics, they are still relying on the ideas that they can separate Germany from Russia, China from Russia, and so on, so as to keep the whole of Eurasia fractured. I think that very idea that Anglo-Saxon powers can control the world just by controlling maritime trade and world sea trade routes is something which is totally artificial and which is coming to an end. It is natural that countries of Eurasia do cooperate, be that Germany and Russia or Russia and China, be that Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine with the rest of Europe, but it is natural. Geographically speaking, Eurasia is a single space. It has become a space of conflicts only due to the strategy as proposed and advocated by Halford Mackinder and adopted by the entire Anglo-American establishment as a single doctrine. So to the present day, they are still trying to implement this very doctrine to create conflicts in order to fracture Eurasian space. I believe at some point it will come to reversion or inversion, and that Eurasia will eventually become a single space. After all, the Chinese are building one belt, one road infrastructure for that purpose. That's why the Chinese are doing it. They just reverse the logic of Mackinder's theory. So instead of having conflicts in Eurasian space, they are trying to create infrastructure for cooperation between Europe, Central Asia, and China, so as to create a single geo-economic and geopolitical space. Russia has adopted some of the logic in these games and is using the Balkans in exchange for Ukraine. They cannot afford themselves to have NATO in Ukraine, just as the US couldn't afford to have some Russian ally to be located in Canada or Mexico. Try to imagine the US and their reaction if Russia wanted to have some influence in Canada or some influence in Mexico. What would be the American reaction? They would launch a nuclear war without any hesitation. So Russians cannot afford to have NATO on their borders in Ukraine, and they will fight against it by all means. If Ukraine wants to enter NATO, you will have the World War, and we will all have the World War. That's what I'm pretty sure about, and that's what is going on behind the scenes most of the time. But if you want to, as Adnan said, to pursue your own interests, to remain neutral, to try to be in friendly relations with all the neighboring countries, including Russia, then we have a good perspective of not having a world war, of having some kind of future cooperation on a broader space of Eurasia. I see it as a natural and inevitable development. Either that is going to happen or we will have a war. These are two options which are in the game, more or less. Probably the US will accept at some point to withdraw into its own Western hemisphere as they used to be. There was a Monroe Doctrine once upon a time, which said that the US should not interfere with European problems and should remain controlling South America, taking resources from South America and living on its own very successfully. But the UK is the breaking point which managed to draw the US into European conflicts in the First World War, and that is something which has created the world as we have it. That we have the so-called Atlantic architecture, that practically two Atlantic powers are trying to control the rest of the world by creating conflicts in all other parts of the world whenever there is relevant for them. So I'm afraid that both of our countries are victims of that strategy, especially of the modification of the same strategy called the Clash of Civilizations, because we are both on dividing lines between Eastern and Western Christianity, and in Bosnian case of Islam too. So it's easy to claim that Russia is the bad guy, but the world is much more complicated, and you will probably soon learn it. But I would beg you, really, I would beg you not to try to become a part of NATO, because then that would be the end of the entire world as we know it.
Okay, I think I'm sure that it's even more options than two, but I think one of the more options that Russia will recognize the mistake that they killed 14,000 Ukrainians just trying to keep out Ukraine of the NATO, pay couple trillions for Crimea and back Crimea to Ukraine, pay couple trillions for Donbass and back Donbass to Ukraine. And after this, we will try to build a friendly relationship with Russia. This is only this option on this time, because Putin made a lot of mistakes and he killed 14,000 Ukrainians. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say that, okay,
well, you know, Serbia killed 100,000 Bosnians and no one cares.
Okay, but we are curious. We care about it. So we care about it, and we try to care about it, and we try to use all of possible means to make Putin to pay for it. In NATO, out of NATO, inside of EU, out of EU. It's unfortunately this is a reality which Ukraine is for Ukraine it's impossible to avoid if we try to be a nation, and the Ukrainians is a nation. Even Putin is trying to say that we are not exist at all, but Ukrainians exist. So now, Zlatko, we will continue this discussion for sure, and I'm sure that we will discuss it maybe in Sarajevo. I hope for this, drinking some tea or other drinks. Now I'd like to finally to give the floor to Anatoly Demishuk. I think that he will find to answer something and react something for all of our great discussion. Very high level discussion. We touching all of theoretical and actually our reality on a very high level, even higher than strategic, I would say. So Anatoly, the floor is yours. Please give us your reactions on the discussion. I think you are in the favorable position because you heard everything.
Everything was already told. So I need just to represent some my opinion.
Yeah, so please give us some fresh food for discussion.
Yeah, first of all, good morning everybody. Posebno hoću da pozdravim poštovane bosanske kolege, ali ću da pričam engleski, eto. A lot of interesting insights, opinions were told today. Of course, some of these opinions were polar, but it's very important. When we discuss something, it's a bit boring if everybody has the same opinion or same position. So the truth is born during discussion. Yeah. So first of all, I need to say that respecting all these differences between Bosnia and Ukraine, both our countries are let's say hostages of their geographical or geopolitical location or position on the map. Yeah, and I would like to make some short excursion to recent history. Of course, our story starts in 1999 when two big socialist federations collapsed, both USSR and Yugoslavia, and new young states in Southeastern Europe were born. And that was a time of versatile opportunities for all these countries. And I would like to emphasize that for all these post-communist countries, it was a time of some euphoria. So almost everybody expected that capitalism comes, democracy comes, we're now free, and some prosperous life is waiting for us just in a few years. Yeah, and of course, it was this 1990s. It was a period of triumph of Western liberal democracy. So the Cold War was finished, and the USA was on the peak of its power. It was the USA was like one superpower in the world. So in this period, Ukrainians Ukraine became independent in 1999 without any wars. So it was kind of peaceful and calm way. So some people were a bit kind of disorientated this time. For example, in 1989, I'm sure that very small part of people expected that Soviet Union would collapse in a few years. Yeah. So in 1999, Ukraine had a huge potential and opportunities. And of course, the main problem of Ukraine, in my opinion, during all these 30 years was the lack of strict and clear national idea and some clear road, some ambitious road. Because when we are looking to all these 30 years from nowadays perspective, we see that from the very beginning, Ukraine was not allowed by big powers to become an ambitious project. So it's our problem of this, I would say, border location. Yeah. So from the very beginning, nobody wanted in the world to let us to become some superpower. For example, we used to have even nuclear weapon after the collapse of USSR, but even Western countries told us to give this nuclear power. And we got this Budapest memorandum, and this memorandum, unfortunately, hasn't helped us. Yeah, but during all this time, some even bigger half of Ukrainians had some Western dream. So in our eyes, during all these decades, West or Europe was like land of dreams. So We just want to become a part of Europe. We want to enter the European Union. And we, even today, we perceive Western Europe as it used to be in 1990s, during the time of triumph of democracy. But times changed, and now Western liberal democracy, unfortunately, is in some kind of crisis, both USA and Western Europe. I don't want to deep in all these details. I hope you understand what I mean. So, and so we want to enter Europe, we want to enter NATO, but not all of us understand what is the current state of these organizations and Western world at all. But till 2014, actually, Ukraine enjoyed peaceful development. Of course, we constantly had some economical crises and some challenges in this area, some political internal conflicts, but these conflicts, they didn't lead to any clashes, yeah, or worse. But after 2014, we got in a very bad situation where we found ourselves on this dividing line or front line of, let's say, new Cold War. That's why I started to talk about Ukrainian ambitions and the very beginning of our independence. Given the fact that from the early days of our independence, we weren't planned as an ambitious project. Ukraine, with the beginning of conflict with Russia, Ukraine became not a subject, but more like object of foreign policy, unfortunately. And in many dimensions, our hands are like we don't have free hands, yeah, and we are depends very much on our international partners, yeah. And I don't want to repeat all these good things and insights that colleagues told already today, but generally I share this opinion that we cannot expect now that some good people from West just solve our problems and protect us. And Bosnian case in this situation is very useful, yeah. Personally for me, a very nice perspective is so-called intermarium or Balto-Black Sea Alliance. Of course, entering NATO could have some very harsh outcomes. Why, perhaps, yeah, I would agree with it. From the other hand, we can another option. Yeah, Mr. Samus told that always we should have not two but more options. Yeah. Next option is to become not a member of NATO but a personal ally of USA. It's a very interesting way, perhaps more effective. But another way is to cooperate more closely and more effectively with Eastern European countries, Poland, Baltic countries, Moldova, Georgia, this Baltic Black Sea belt. And in ideal situation, Belarus would be our very good ally, but now it's this country is quite different position. Yeah. So I think that if Ukraine provided during all these 30 years more confident and clear national politic, if our state building policy was like more palpable and more effective, we wouldn't get now in such unpleasant situation. But first of all, now we can't solve this situation just easily and quickly. And here I would like to agree totally with Mr. Izetbegović when he told that we should rely more on our own powers, on ourselves, yeah. And also he told about Turkey, that Turkey could become a good ally and respective ally for Ukraine, credible ally, yeah. And this idea just goes in the same way as an idea of intermarium, yeah. So this Baltic Black Sea belt, because Turkey now is going more and more its own way out, which is not in the same direction that the rest of NATO. And from the other hand, when we're talking about Bosnia, yeah, I need to admit that in Ukraine, when we are talking about Balkan experience, about Yugoslav crisis, people know about two scenarios. It's very common. This topic is very common in our media. So there are two scenarios, one good and one bad. So good scenario is Croatian scenario of restoring its own territorial integrity, like Operation Oluja, Bljesak, Storm, yeah, in 1999. So Croats did this. But I also used to be an apologist of this Croatian experience, but now after some researches I changed my opinion, yeah, because Croatian victory in that war was caused mostly not by internal factors, not by army building, but by international conditions and American help. Because Americans wanted to solve Bosnian crisis, first of all, they didn't care so much about Croatia. They needed Croats to be like their tool to beat a bit more Serbs and to finish the war in Bosnia. Yeah, but generally, Croatian scenario is something good in Ukrainian media. So it's when you have a powerful army and you just defeat your enemy. But Bosnian scenario is associated with something very bad. It's when you have a country that is formally united and one, but it's terribly internally divided. Yeah, I'm used to be in Bosnia a few times, yeah, and I was impressed by the beauty of this land, these mountains, rivers, Mostar, Sarajevo, Trebinje, Banja Luka, Travnik, super. It's a very good land with very good people. And all these people are quite similar. Bosniaks, Serbians, and Croats, they're generally speaking kind of one language. They have similar traditions, habits, but these people hate each other even today. And these scarce wounds of this war of 90s are very sensitive even today. So when I was, for example, driving through Bosnian districts, in these districts you could see these state symbols, black, blue and yellow flags and so on. So it's like modern Bosnians state symbolic. And also you could see this Liljane, this how to say in English, it's a Bosnian flag from 90s, yeah. But for example, in Republika Srpska, you can't see any Bosnian formal flags. You can see only Cyrillic alphabet and Serbian flags. So these people, they really don't feel that they are like citizens of Bosnia, but they associate themselves with Serbian idea, Serbian world in Serbia. And the same situation is with Croats in Bosnia. They formally don't have their own autonomy or entity. They share the common federation with Bosniaks, but they also don't feel themselves as Bosnians. So it's a tragedy. And what makes this tragedy is even worse, that before this war, during Yugoslavia, all these divisions were practically invisible. So Bosnia was considered in that socialist times as an ideal republic of brotherhood and unity, bratstvo jedinstvo. So it's a problem. And then just in a few years, these people, these neighbors started to kill each other. So it's horrible. And it's very good lesson, very good lesson. Yeah, of course, today our position, Ukrainian position and Bosnian position is a bit different. But both our countries share this vulnerability of its geographical location. So, of course, we should perceive reality not in black and white colors, but more in terms of realpolitik. And of course, nobody can guarantee to Ukrainians their independence and safety. We should rely, first of all, on ourselves. But we need to understand that even Western community easily can impose us some peaceful solution, like in Bosnia, yes, that would conservate these divisions, yeah. So Ukrainians here, you have ruined Donbass, put money, rebuild it, but give them autonomy, and that's all, and all your Western perspective is frozen. Yeah, so we need to understand this as well. Also, I would like to admit, when talking about Croatia, then a few years ago, the idea of peaceful reintegration of Donbass really popped up in our media. Yeah, Croatia really reintegrated this Eastern Slavonia without any warfare, with help of international community, United States and United Nations. But this was a very painful compromise for Croats, because they needed to make amnestia for some people who even did some war crimes, yeah. And Serbs and Croats in this region, even till today, they live in some kind of segregation, yeah. This reintegration finished in 1998, but even today, these people are psychologically divided. So personally, when we're speaking about my position, I don't want such scenario for Ukraine, for example. It's a bad price, yeah. But of course, we can speak a lot, and a lot of very good ideas and perspectives were presented here today. But we are not prophets. Of course, we can't predict everything, or yes, that expect us. But I can make one crucial conclusion for today, is that we really need to conduct such conferences and discussions more and more often, because when we share our own positions that even are totally different, it helps us to find some common sense. So of course, yeah, I would like to be a part of more such events. Yeah, and of course, I hope that Mr. Samus could make some better and more general conclusions about our conversations. And personally, from me, I would like to thank you very much. Yeah, it was highly interesting, and I even discovered some totally new ideas about Western role in Yugoslav crisis today. Thank you, Mr. Hadžidedić. It was really very important for me. Yeah, so thank you very much. Ďakujem, hvala puno.
Thank you very much, Anatoly. You made a panoramic overview of a situation of the conference and our opinions. I think that yeah, we have mostly finished our time, but I think that we can propose to discussants and colleagues who wants to say something. Okay, so I'd like to say the floor Mr. Idrisbegovic, and after this Katarina, if you want.
I would like to respond to your statement that you expect a payment for Donetsk, Luhansk, or Crimea. I know it will sound heretical, but we Bosnians are natural-born heretics. Do not expect any payment under any conditions. Do not let others negotiate your peace with Russia. Do it yourself. Do not misperceive Putin. I know this will be a kind of crazy. Putin is, in effect, in a weird way, your ally. I know that it is not exactly easy to digest this, but just think of it. If it was not Putin, there will be an old school leader of Russia at the beginning of conflict. They didn't took Crimea for any reasons. They have extremely narrow access to the sea. Azov Sea is useless for military purposes and for civilian as well. They didn't have other option. If it was an old school general in his position, he will roll tanks to the Dnieper River. He is a more developed, more modern politician. That is a novelty for Russians. Russians are not exactly, in a military sense, very careful and delicate. They are pretty brutal. When you say they have killed 14,000 of Ukrainians, do not forget that during Second World War, they have been instrumentalized Ukrainians, Ukrainian front in particular, to fight Russians, to fight Russian war against Germans, to punish Ukrainians for sort of collaboration with the Germans at the beginning of war. So it costed you, if I remember well, 14 million, a lion's shares of Russian losses in the Second World War. So they are not very delicate when Ukrainians are in. So consider 14,000, no matter how painful it is, as a very cheap price. That's unpleasant reality. And also consider the bad option. Putin will remain in power for approximately 7 or 8 years. He's an old man. Who will replace him? That is a problem for both Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's more problem for Ukraine. Prospects in this regards are not good. So he will probably be succeeded with someone worse. After the Second World War, there was so-called Trieste crisis, Trst crisis, when Yugoslav partisans occupied a part of Italy. And the conflict lasted for years until Americans told Italians, solve the problem with Tito. He's reasonable. Who knows who will succeed him? So I'm telling you, try to solve the problem with Putin. He's reasonable. His successor can be God knows what. Use your time frame, which is available. And you said that Putin made several mistakes. I'm afraid he didn't. Russia has seriously improved strategic planning. After the total collapse of a Soviet system, they have recovered fully. Bear that in mind. They are not a joke as they used to be. So much from me. Excuse me if I was...
Talking about the mistakes, I think that Crimea was total mistake because they had all of possibility to use Black Sea from Sevastopol. They had a military base there. They had all of possibility to use Crimea in economical, culture, any ways they want. So it wasn't any problem for Russians to use all of opportunity from Crimea in military, geopolitically, whatever. But they wanted to have a kind of military sign or emperor sign for Putin. I don't know. It was some wish by Putin, which is, I think this is concrete mistake, because he could made it by other instruments and had better results as they have now, because from all of international law, it's a trap. They should answer for these acts because otherwise they need to destroy Ukraine, because Ukraine making the cases in international law every day with thousands of the cases from the level of the states, and the processes step by step they go into the conclusions, and as the same like MH17 case, it's obviously that Russians killed this aircraft. Of course, I'm not sure that they wanted to kill this aircraft because they want to kill Ukrainian military aircraft, but the mistake of Putin, at least they should make behavior like Iranian last case with Ukrainian aircraft. They just recognize that they make at least like this, but not to say that it's not our problems. So I think, unfortunately, I think we should stop here. And Katerina, sorry for this, because I think we have a lack of time. Dear colleagues, I'm absolutely happy that we start this project. We start with you, and Kat arrived. It means that we are doing everything is proper way. Colleagues, I think that we should continue. I think we should write our suggestions and propositions after first event. I hope that we, in some time, will meet together in some beautiful place in Sarajevo or Kiev, or maybe other places in our countries, to make our discussions even more fruitful, because I think that 2 hours it's absolutely nothing for such a level of expertise and discussions. So first of all, I'd like to thank to Dr. Hadžidedić for preparations and organization of our event, and collecting so great Bosnian experts to participate in our event. I'm absolutely happy to meet with you, and I hope that we will make some even better projects together. So I like to thanks to Ukrainian experts, Katerina and Anatoly. I think that we will continue our efforts on Balkan Ukrainian cooperation, and especially Bosnian Ukrainian cooperation, and better understanding of each other. Because I think that the best way to understand what is going on and what should we do, it's understand our lessons, our best practices, worst practices, best variants and bad options, and maybe we will understand what we should advise our politicians, advise to our people on the front line, advise our people on the think tanks in other spheres, what we should do in next days and maybe next decades. So thank you very much for your time, for your efforts, for your thoughts, ideas, insights. Thank you very much, and looking forward